Germany had conquered Poland in weeks. France fell in 42 days. Yugoslavia collapsed in 11. By the summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht appeared unstoppable, a mechanized force that had rewritten the rules of modern warfare. Yet within 6 months, that same army would experience something it had never known: defeat. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a strategic redeployment, but a decisive, brutal defeat inflicted by an enemy they had been told could not fight, on ground they had been promised would fall like all the others. The Battle of Moscow in 1941 marked the first time Germany's war machine met an immovable object, and the collision would reshape the course of the entire war. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The plan had been deceptively simple. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, envisioned the complete destruction of the Soviet Union within 4 months. 3 million German and Axis troops crossed the border that morning in the largest invasion force ever assembled. Army Group North would advance toward Leningrad. Army Group South would seize Ukraine's industrial heartland and agricultural wealth. Army Group Center, the strongest of the three, would drive directly toward Moscow. The German High Command believed the Soviet state would collapse once its capital fell. Intelligence reports suggested the Red Army was disorganized, poorly led, and crippled by Stalin's purges of the officer corps. Early results seemed to confirm every assumption. Soviet airfields were destroyed before pilots could reach their planes. Entire armies were encircled in massive pockets, yielding hundreds of thousands of prisoners. By mid-July, German forces had advanced 400 miles, crossing the Dnieper River and capturing the fortress city of Smolensk. Moscow lay just 200 miles beyond. Yet the advance began to slow. Soviet resistance, though often poorly coordinated, proved fiercer than anticipated. German supply lines stretched across scorched roads where Soviet forces had destroyed bridges, railways, and fuel depots in systematic withdrawals. The Wehrmacht's logistics had been designed for a short campaign, and by August, ammunition stocks ran low. Panzer divisions that began Barbarossa with full strength now operated at half their authorized tank numbers. Replacement vehicles arrived slowly, and many damaged tanks remained in field repair shops hundreds of miles behind the front. Then Hitler made a decision that would haunt the campaign. Rather than press directly toward Moscow, he ordered Army Group Center to divert its mobile forces south to assist in encircling Soviet armies defending Kiev. The operation succeeded brilliantly, netting over 600,000 prisoners and clearing Ukraine. But it consumed 5 critical weeks, 5 weeks during which Soviet forces dug defensive lines west of Moscow. 5 weeks during which factories in the Urals began producing T-34 tanks in growing numbers. 5 weeks that would make the difference between autumn and winter. By late September, Hitler redirected his attention to the Soviet capital. Operation Typhoon, as the offensive was named, represented Germany's final attempt to win the war in the east before winter. The forces assembled for the assault appeared overwhelming. Army Group Center fielded 78 divisions, including 14 Panzer and 8 motorized divisions, totaling nearly 2 million men. Over 1,000 tanks and assault guns supported the advance, backed by 14,000 artillery pieces. Luftwaffe bombers and fighters, though reduced from their June strength, still numbered over 1,400 aircraft. The German plan called for classic blitzkrieg encirclement tactics. 3 panzer groups would punch through Soviet defensive lines, then curve behind enemy positions to trap Red Army forces in massive pockets. Once Soviet resistance west of Moscow collapsed, armored spearheads would race to the capital from multiple directions. German commanders expected the city to fall within weeks, certainly before the first snows arrived. The Soviet defensive position appeared precarious. 3 fronts, the Western Reserve and Bryansk, held a line stretching across the approaches to Moscow. They fielded 1.25 million men, but many divisions existed only on paper, their ranks filled with hastily mobilized civilians who had received minimal training. Tank strength totaled approximately 1,000 vehicles, many of them obsolete models. Artillery numbered 7,600 guns, a substantial force but spread thin across a front hundreds of kilometers wide. The Soviet Air Force had suffered catastrophic losses since June, and though factories worked around the clock to replace destroyed aircraft, pilot training remained inadequate. Yet Soviet forces possessed advantages German intelligence failed to recognize. The railway network behind Soviet lines remained intact, allowing rapid movement of reserves. Soviet commanders had learned painful lessons during the summer's disasters and were beginning to apply defensive tactics that traded space for time. Most critically, Stalin had authorized the transfer of divisions from Siberia and the Far East, veteran units equipped for winter warfare that were now moving westward by rail. Operation Typhoon began on September 30, 1941, and initial German success exceeded all expectations. Panzer divisions knifed through Soviet defensive positions, exploiting gaps and racing deep into the rear. Within days, German mobile forces completed massive encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk. 4 Soviet armies found themselves surrounded west of Vyazma, cut off from supply and reinforcement. At Bryansk, 3 more Soviet armies were trapped in a pocket that German infantry divisions rapidly compressed. The Wehrmacht claimed 673,000 prisoners from these twin victories, though Soviet records suggest a somewhat lower figure of 514,000. Either way, the encirclements represented a catastrophe. Entire divisions ceased to exist. 41% of Soviet strength defending the approaches to Moscow had been destroyed or captured. German commanders congratulated themselves on repeating the successes of the summer. On October 9th, Otto Dietrich, Hitler's press chief, announced to the world that the Soviet armies defending Moscow had been annihilated. The road to the capital lay open, yet the trapped Soviet forces refused to surrender quickly. They fought with desperation, tying down 28 German divisions needed for the advance on Moscow. Some encircled units broke through German lines in small groups, retreating eastward to reform. Others held their ground for days, consuming German ammunition and fuel. This resistance bought time, days, and then weeks during which Soviet commanders rushed reserves forward to man new defensive positions. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, recently transferred from Leningrad, took command of the Western Front on October 10th. He found the situation nearly hopeless, with only 90,000 men and fewer than 150 tanks to defend a front stretching 200 kilometers. But Zhukov possessed an asset that would prove decisive. Fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East arrived daily by rail. These were not hastily formed militia units, but regular army formations with experienced officers, proper equipment, and training for winter combat. By late October, 15 rifle divisions and 3 cavalry divisions had reached the Moscow defenses. More were coming. Then the weather intervened. On October 7th, the first snow fell across the front. It melted almost immediately, but the moisture turned roads into rivers of mud. This phenomenon, known in Russia as Rasputitsa, transformed the landscape into an impassable morass. German tanks that could travel 50 kilometers per hour on paved roads now struggled to advance 500 meters in a day. Wheeled vehicles simply stopped moving. Horses pulling supply wagons collapsed from exhaustion. Infantry divisions, already reduced by months of combat, slogged forward through mud that sucked boots from feet and caked uniforms with layers of freezing slime. German logistics, marginal even in good conditions, now approached complete breakdown. Fuel convoys that should have reached forward units in days took weeks. Ammunition supplies ran critically low. Spare parts for vehicles became unobtainable. Food rations shrank as supply trucks bogged down miles from the front. The German advance, nevertheless, continued. Discipline and training pushed exhausted soldiers forward, even as cold rain turned to sleet and then to snow. By mid-November, advanced German units had reached Klin, just 80 kilometers from Moscow. A reconnaissance unit from the 258th Infantry Division reached the town of Khimki on the northern outskirts of the capital, close enough that German officers claimed they could see the spires of the Kremlin through field glasses. To the south, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army fought toward Tula, attempting to encircle Moscow from below. German forces had never come this close to final victory. They could see their objective. Some units were within artillery range of the city center, yet they could advance no farther. Tank engines refused to start in temperatures that plunged to minus 35 degrees Celsius. Vehicle lubricants froze solid. Water-cooled machine guns became useless chunks of metal. Infantry divisions reported 50% casualties from frostbite. Medical facilities overflowed with soldiers suffering from exposure. The Wehrmacht had not prepared for winter warfare. Requests for winter clothing had been filed in September, but the shipments remained stuck in Poland as railways prioritized fuel and ammunition. German soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets torn from Russian homes. They stuffed newspapers inside their uniforms for insulation. Some took felt boots and winter coats from Soviet prisoners and corpses. But these improvised measures could not compensate for the systematic failure to equip an army for the Russian winter. Soviet forces, meanwhile, continued to strengthen. By early December, Marshal Zhukov commanded 58 divisions, including the fresh Siberian units equipped with winter gear, skis, and white camouflage uniforms. Soviet intelligence had confirmed that Japan would not attack in the Far East, allowing Stalin to strip those regions of troops without fear. Tank production had reached levels that replaced monthly losses. The T-34, superior to any German tank in armor and firepower, now equipped entire armored brigades. Soviet artillery, always plentiful, had been reorganized into concentrated batteries capable of pulverizing German defensive positions. Most importantly, Soviet commanders had learned to coordinate attacks, combining infantry, armor, and artillery in operations that, while still crude compared to German standards, had become significantly more effective than the chaotic efforts of the summer. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive began. It struck along a front stretching hundreds of kilometers, hitting German positions that were overextended, undersupplied, and weakened by cold. The Germans, who believed Soviet forces were near collapse, found themselves facing coordinated assaults by fresh divisions. The First Shock Army attacked from the north. Cavalry units, moving rapidly through snow-covered forests on routes impassable to German vehicles, penetrated deep into rear areas. Ski battalions raided supply depots and cut communication lines. Soviet tank brigades, their T-34s functioning perfectly, in conditions that immobilized German panzers, overwhelmed defensive positions. German units that had advanced to within sight of Moscow now found themselves fighting desperately to avoid encirclement. Hitler, receiving reports of the Soviet attacks, issued orders forbidding any retreat. Units were to hold their positions regardless of circumstances. Commanders who suggested withdrawing to defensible lines were relieved of command. This inflexibility, born from Hitler's belief that willpower could overcome material reality, transformed what could have been an orderly withdrawal into near disaster. German divisions found themselves surrounded in isolated pockets, supplied only by Luftwaffe transport aircraft that faced increasingly effective Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Some units broke out through Soviet lines, abandoning heavy equipment and fighting their way westward in brutal winter conditions. Others held surrounded positions for weeks before relief columns reached them. The Wehrmacht's losses mounted catastrophically. Between October and January, German forces suffered 250,000 to 400,000 casualties, a staggering 40% of the troops committed to Operation Typhoon. Tank losses were equally severe, with over 700 panzers destroyed or abandoned. Entire panzer divisions reported tank strength below 50 vehicles, a fraction of authorized numbers. Soviet casualties dwarfed even these horrific German figures. During the defensive phase of the Battle of Moscow, from September to early December, Soviet forces lost 514,000 killed or missing and 144,000 wounded. The counteroffensive that followed claimed another 140,000 killed or missing and 231,000 wounded. Total Soviet casualties exceeded 1 million men, losses that would have destroyed most armies. Yet the Soviet Union, with its vast population and expanding industrial base, could absorb such losses and continue fighting. Germany could not. The Wehrmacht had committed the majority of its available strength to Operation Typhoon. There were no strategic reserves remaining in Germany. Replacement troops consisted of hastily trained recruits, older men, and convalescents returned to duty before fully healed. The panzer divisions that had seemed invincible in June now existed as shadows of their former strength. The Battle of Moscow ended in January 1942, not with a climactic final battle, but with exhausted German forces digging in along defensive lines far from their objectives. Moscow remained unconquered. The Soviet government, which had partially evacuated the city in October during the panic following the Vyazma-Bryansk encirclements, returned. Factories resumed production. The Red Army, though bloodied, had proven it could not only survive, but counterattack effectively. German generals who had dismissed the Soviet military as incompetent now faced the realization that they were fighting an enemy capable of learning, adapting, and matching German tactical innovations. The easy victories of the summer would not be repeated. The consequences extended beyond the immediate military situation. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the German army, suffered a heart attack in November and was dismissed in December. Hitler assumed personal command of the army, a decision that would have profound implications for all subsequent German military operations. Dozens of senior commanders were relieved for requesting permission to withdraw. The principle of flexible defense, which German military doctrine had always emphasized, was replaced by Hitler's insistence on holding every position. This inflexibility would cost Germany dearly in the years to come. For the Soviet Union, the Battle of Moscow represented vindication. Stalin's decision to hold the capital, rather than abandoning it, as some generals had suggested, had proven correct. Zhukov emerged as the Soviet Union's most capable commander, a reputation he would reinforce at Stalingrad and in subsequent operations. Soviet industry, evacuated to the Urals and Siberia, demonstrated it could outproduce Germany in tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The Soviet people, who had endured catastrophic losses and the occupation of vast territories, now knew that victory was possible. The Red Army, written off by Western observers as defeated in the summer of 1941, had struck back with devastating effect. The Battle of Moscow did not end the war. 3.5 years of brutal combat lay ahead. German forces would launch major offensives in 1942 and 1943. But never again would the Wehrmacht achieve the kind of sweeping victories that characterized Barbarossa's opening months. Never again would German commanders believe that one more offensive, one more encirclement, would break Soviet resistance. The defeat at Moscow proved that Germany could not win a war of attrition against an enemy with greater population, expanding industrial capacity, and willingness to accept casualties that would have shattered other nations. The myth of German invincibility died in the snow outside Moscow, replaced by the grinding reality of a war that Germany could not win but could not escape. The historical significance of the battle lies not in any single engagement, but in what it revealed about the fundamental nature of the Eastern Front. Germany had entered the Soviet Union expecting a campaign like those in Poland, France, and the Balkans. Instead, they found a war unlike anything in modern military history, a conflict measured not in weeks or months, but in years, where victory required not just tactical excellence, but industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and the ability to sustain operations across vast distances in extreme conditions. The Wehrmacht possessed none of these advantages. The Soviet Union, despite its staggering losses and near collapse in 1941, possessed all of them. Moscow was where that reality first became impossible to ignore. The German soldiers who survived the battle would remember the winter of 1941 for the rest of their lives. They would remember the cold that turned skin black with frostbite, the hunger from inadequate rations, the desperation of fighting an enemy that seemed to multiply no matter how many were killed. They would remember watching comrades collapse from exhaustion and freeze to death in the snow. They would remember the T-34 tanks that shrugged off German anti-tank fire and the Soviet artillery barrages that lasted hours. Most of all, they would remember the realization, gradual but inexorable, that the war could not be won, that all the victories of the summer had led only to this frozen landscape where survival itself required all the strength they possessed. The Battle of Moscow proved that tanks could be stopped by mud and cold, that brilliant tactics could not overcome logistics, that even the finest army in the world could not conquer a country the size of the Soviet Union before winter arrived. These lessons seem obvious in retrospect. They were not obvious in September 1941, when German forces stood poised to capture Moscow and end the war. History turned on those weeks between October and January, on the Rasputitsa that immobilized the Wehrmacht, on the Siberian divisions that arrived just in time, on the decision to defend Moscow rather than abandon it, and on the willingness of Soviet soldiers to die in numbers that stagger comprehension. The German offensive that was meant to end the war instead ensured it would continue, transforming a campaign of conquest into a war of annihilation that would consume both nations. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.